power doesn't die quietly. Sometimes it's taken, and sometimes it's forced to confess. The world thought it was over, that the coup in Ivory Coast had concluded with President Alassane Ouattara's fall. But what came next was far more dangerous than a military takeover. It was a reckoning. At 4:36 a.m. on the second day of the uprising, a classified image leaked. Ouattara, alive, seated under military custody, calm, dignified, but undeniably defeated, not in exile, not executed, but held by his own army. The photo shattered the international narrative. Ouattara had not escaped, as Western media had claimed. He was in Ivory Coast, and he was being asked to do the unthinkable. The man who had risen to power with IMF credentials, backed by France and praised by Washington, was now at the mercy of a younger generation of nationalist officers, led by a name soon to shake every embassy in Abidjan, General Sékou Dumbia. He wasn't a politician, he wasn't a celebrity. He was a disciplined, silent soldier with one goal. Ouattara came into power with the West. Let him leave power by rejecting it. It wasn't revenge. It was symbolism, a declaration to Africa and the world that the age of puppets and puppeteers was over. For decades, Africa was forced to choose between silence and survival. But now, a former president was being asked to choose between legacy and loyalty, and the world held its breath. Every revolution has its shadow general, until the day he steps into the light. Before the coup, General Sékou Dumbia was almost unknown outside military circles. No media appearances, no leaks, no flamboyance, just a clean record and quiet movements through the ranks. But within the Ivorian army, he was something else entirely, a symbol of dignity in a force bent under political weight. Born in Korhogo, raised during the turbulence of the Civil War, Dumbia witnessed how politics turned soldiers into pawns and generals into bodyguards for presidents, not protectors of the people. He studied military doctrine in Mali, strategy in Sudan, and insurgency response in Burkina Faso, not through Western programs, but through alliances built across sovereign African defense academies. He refused training invitations from France. He returned every bonus offered to suppress protests, and he kept asking the question many feared to raise: who is the army really serving? By 2024, the top brass saw him as a threat, but the younger soldiers, they saw him as a compass. So when the orders came to suppress another round of demonstrations in Abobo, Dumbia did something unprecedented. He refused. That night, dozens of soldiers joined him. In 48 hours, he had the loyalty of 3 major battalions and control over key transportation routes in and out of Abidjan. He didn't issue a manifesto. He didn't demand power. He marched on the palace, took Ouattara without bloodshed, and made only one request: speak and tell the truth about who you served. It wasn't just about taking down a regime, it was about taking down its narrative. Dumbia didn't want to become the next ruler. He wanted to end the illusion that Africa's rulers were truly in charge to begin with. You cannot break the machine if you do not name the hand turning its gears. In the hours following Ouattara's capture, no shots were fired, no looting, no chaos, and that was intentional. General Dumbia wanted the world to understand this was not a coup of ambition, it was a coup of exposure. Inside a sealed military base on the outskirts of Yamoussoukro, the deposed president was given medical care, food, and a written demand. It was simple, just one paragraph to be read aloud on national television. I, Alassane Ouattara, acknowledge that elements of my governance were shaped and guided by foreign influence, and I recognize the right of Ivory Coast to determine its own political and economic destiny without interference. At first, he refused. He was tired, cornered, embarrassed, but not broken. He believed the West would come for him, that France would issue a condemnation, that the US would call for his release. But no one did. They were silent, waiting, weighing their options, and that silence began to suffocate him. Meanwhile, Dumbia's forces released selected documents, secret contracts, offshore payments, resource agreements signed with French companies without parliamentary approval. They didn't smear him with slander, they suffocated him with receipts. One file alone revealed that a single European energy firm had paid $82 million in development consulting to an account traced back to Ouattara's inner circle. This wasn't a scandal. It was confirmation of what the people had always suspected. Then came the second message from Dumbia, not to Ouattara, but to the people. We will not move forward until the past admits what it was. Ivory Coast was not demanding an apology. It was demanding a confession, because true independence doesn't begin with elections. It begins with truth. What breaks a man is not chains, it's silence, followed by clarity. For 3 days, Alassane Ouattara remained silent. The outside world speculated. International outlets continued to spin the story as house arrest, negotiated transition, or temporary instability. But inside the walls of the military base, the reality was very different. Ouattara wasn't being tortured. He was being reminded, page by page, file by file, of the consequences of his presidency. The mining licenses granted without parliamentary review, the deployment of gendarmes to suppress anti-CFA franc protests, the quiet renewal of French military access agreements in exchange for IMF leniency. Each morning, Dumbia's envoys delivered him a folder. Each evening, he was offered the chance to respond, not to them, but to the people. But he refused. Until the 4th day, a moment captured, discreetly, on camera. Ouattara, seated in uniform, leaned forward and whispered, "If I speak, they will abandon me, and if I don't, I will abandon myself." And there it was. Not fear, not pride, but the awareness of a man who realized his foreign sponsors were no longer backing him. Across the continent, African leaders were watching, some in terror, others in awe. Because this wasn't just the fall of a president. This was the rise of a new kind of accountability, one that could not be silenced by embassies or dollars. Meanwhile, in Abidjan, people were gathering, not in protest, in silence. Outside the RTI broadcasting building, citizens sat for hours with signs that read, "Let him speak. Before elections, let us hear the truth. We forgive, but not without confession." This wasn't vengeance. This was national therapy. The general had not asked for surrender. He had asked for truth. And in doing so, he had weaponized something far more powerful than fear: conscience. Silence is never neutral. Sometimes it's complicity. As Ivory Coast held its breath for Ouattara's next move, the Western world was quiet, eerily quiet. There were no official rescue attempts, no urgent diplomatic convoys, no threats of sanctions or emergency UN sessions. Why? Because France, the EU, and the US were calculating. Publicly defending a deposed leader known for backroom deals and political repression, while evidence of corruption flooded social media, would be a PR disaster. They had a decision to make: condemn the coup and risk a continental backlash, or remain quiet and let a decades-long asset fall quietly into irrelevance. They chose containment. Statements from Western capitals used the same tired language. We urge restraint. We call for calm and dialogue. We are closely monitoring the situation. But on the ground, Ivorians weren't monitoring. They were moving. Universities began hosting open forums on the legacy of Ouattara's rule. Professors, many once silent, spoke openly about how sovereignty was traded for stability. A renowned economist at Université Félix Houphouët-Boigny delivered a line that went viral: "We were not governed, we were managed," from abroad. Meanwhile, the documents released by Dumbia's administration were reaching far beyond Ivory Coast. In Senegal, Mali, Chad, and the DRC, activists began cross-referencing their own government's trade deals, asking how many leaders were quietly handing away national wealth in exchange for global favor. The coup had become more than a national event. It was now a continental referendum on the West's post-colonial grip. Inside the military compound, Ouattara knew it too. Each time he hesitated to speak, a screen was brought in, showing crowds growing outside, waiting for just one moment of honesty. And on the 7th night, he finally asked, "If I speak, will it make a difference?" General Dumbia replied, "Yes, because you were their tool, but you can choose not to die as one." The West was watching its illusion unravel, and in the ruins, Africa was watching something else: a man confront the very system that once crowned him king. Every empire has a moment it cannot erase. For France, this was it. On the morning of the 8th day, the unexpected happened. A national broadcast was announced. The networks cleared their programming. Cell towers in major cities were reinforced. Thousands flooded cafes, homes, markets, wherever there was a screen. Then, the screen went black and faded into an image no one thought they'd ever see again. Alassane Ouattara, seated, composed, wearing a simple gray jacket, no presidential sash, no flags, just a microphone. The broadcast had no title, no watermark, no state logo. It was a confession. "I speak today not as a president, but as a son of this soil who lost his way. The room fell silent. I believed I was doing what was necessary. I believed that partnership with the West would bring prosperity. But in truth, I allowed Ivory Coast to become compliant to foreign interests. We didn't grow. We were managed. And I helped them do it. There were no tears, no dramatic gestures, just an unraveling of decades of diplomatic deception. He confirmed secret mining contracts signed without public knowledge, pressure from Western embassies to jail opposition figures, the silent renewal of French military access in exchange for debt forgiveness, the marginalization of Pan-African activists under direct instruction from European intelligence. But perhaps the most powerful line came near the end. We did not fight for independence to become administrators of a foreign-designed script. To the youth of Africa, break the script. To my generation, we failed you. But you must not fail yourselves. And with that, the screen went black again. No anthem, no military salute, just silence. But this time, it was a silence of understanding. Across West Africa, tears flowed. Not for Ouattara, but for what had been stolen in the name of development and diplomacy. In Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, soldiers stopped training to watch. In France, the Quai d'Orsay scrambled to draft a response, one that wouldn't sound like an indictment of their entire policy in Francophone Africa. In Abidjan, General Dumbia stood alone, watching from a remote room. He didn't cheer, he didn't speak, he simply nodded. The general had not asked for a performance. He had asked for the truth, and he got it, from the last man anyone thought would give it. It was never just about one man, it was about all of them. Alassane Ouattara's public confession echoed far beyond Ivory Coast. In Senegal, students gathered at the gates of Parliament holding signs. If Ouattara could admit it, so can Macky. In Gabon, old state contracts were leaked by anonymous civil servants. In Chad, a military colonel posted a single word online, respect. And in the heart of the continent, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a Pan-African analyst declared on live radio. For the first time in post-independence history, a former leader of a Francophone African state admitted that sovereignty was an illusion, and he did it on camera, voluntarily. It wasn't just historic, it was dangerous, for those who still served the same interests. At the African Union, a scheduled summit was suddenly disrupted, leaders argued. Some praised Dumbia's stability through truth approach. Others, still clinging to French patronage, warned that it set a dangerous precedent. But the real conversation wasn't happening in marble halls. It was happening in classrooms, mosques, churches, and refugee camps. Mothers told their children, "That man finally spoke what we already knew." University professors updated their lectures. Political podcasts exploded in popularity. A new phrase began trending across African social platforms. Even African diaspora communities in Paris, Brussels, and Montreal began organizing screenings of the speech, followed by roundtable debates. But for General Dumbia, there was no celebration. His work was not over. He addressed the nation the next day, not with parades or flags, but with sober words. Ivory Coast has received the truth. Now, we must build on it, not to punish the past, but to protect the future. He outlined the next steps: a Truth and Sovereignty Commission to review all foreign partnerships, a new civilian charter to be drafted by a panel of judges, farmers, students, and engineers, a 12-month roadmap to elections. With candidates barred from foreign campaign financing, Africa had long been forced to choose between silence or rebellion. But now it had been handed something rarer: reflection. When the puppet speaks, the puppeteer must pretend they never pulled the strings. After Ouattara's confession, France was in crisis mode. The Élysée Palace summoned emergency advisors. The French ambassador to Abidjan requested a closed-door meeting with General Dumbia. And French media outlets scrambled to control the narrative. They tried framing the confession as emotionally manipulated under duress, an unfortunate result of post-coup instability, a misrepresentation of France's benevolent role in West Africa. But no one was buying it. Not in Abidjan, not in Dakar, not even in Paris. Even French youth activists of African descent rallied outside the National Assembly chanting, "The empire is falling," and the empire knew. The real fear in Paris wasn't that Dumbia had taken power. It was that he hadn't tried to keep it. He wasn't seeking approval. He wasn't playing the same game. He was rewriting the rules. Meanwhile, the United States adopted its favorite position: calculated indifference. A short statement from the State Department read, "We support peaceful transitions and commend President Ouattara's service." But no one missed the omission. There was no mention of the speech, no condemnation of the coup, no reference to Dumbia. Washington wasn't confused. It was nervous. The dominoes were lining up. If Ivory Coast could do this and not collapse, what stopped Cameroon? Togo? Gabon? Benin? Meanwhile, Russia and China took very different approaches. China offered infrastructure deals within days. Russia proposed military training partnerships and joint mineral extraction agreements. But Dumbia remained unmoved. His response? "We are not shifting from one master to another. We are taking responsibility for ourselves. No alliances, no dependency." Instead, the Council announced a continental partnership model, an open-source diplomatic framework inviting African nations to trade, secure, and build with one another based on respect, not control. For decades, foreign powers feared instability in Africa, but what they feared even more was clarity, and Ivory Coast had just made everything unmistakably clear. Liberation is not when the chains are broken. It's when the hands that held them are never trusted again. 3 weeks after Ouattara's televised confession, Ivory Coast did the unthinkable. It opened its future to the people. General Dumbia's council initiated the People's Constitutional Assembly, a national process to rewrite the country's founding document. But this wasn't a top-down committee. Farmers from Korhogo University, students from Bouaké Market, women from Abidjan, fishermen from Sassandra elders, teachers, engineers, and even repatriated members of the diaspora all had a voice. It was live-streamed, transcribed, debated in public parks and cafes. And at the center of it all stood one question: how do we guarantee sovereignty not just in name, but in practice? Proposals flooded in. Ban foreign military bases from operating without public referendum, outlaw campaign financing from foreign governments or corporations, introduce civic education in schools about neo-colonialism and economic sovereignty, create a national sovereignty index updated quarterly to measure how many core sectors, health, energy, security, food, were truly controlled by Ivorians. This was not about isolation. This was about liberation with responsibility. One 24-year-old woman stood at the microphone and said, "We don't want to burn the bridge. We just want to be the ones who decide where it leads." The new constitution also proposed a dramatic change to leadership structure: a rotating executive council of 5, elected by proportional regional votes, replacing the old presidential model. No single leader could serve more than one 4-year term. Emergency powers were no longer tied to individuals, but to citizen assemblies. For many Western political scientists, it was radical. For Ivorians, it was reparative. And what about Ouattara? Still alive, still under protection, still watched by the world, but no longer the center. When asked whether he would endorse the new constitution, he answered from a quiet room, "I have already spoken. Now let them speak louder than I ever did." Africa had long been told its only choice was between tyranny and imported democracy, but Ivory Coast had offered a third path: ownership. The chains are gone, the script is broken, and the story is ours now. 6 months after the coup, Ivory Coast held its first truly sovereign election. No foreign consultants, no imported observers from Europe. Only a coalition of African civic groups, constitutional scholars, and diaspora monitors. Turnout was high. Tensions were low, there were no military parades, no armed guards at voting booths, just families in line, some in silence, some in prayer, most in hope. The winning coalition? A civilian-led alliance rooted in the principles of the People's Constitution. Their agenda was not political, it was structural, reclaiming control of strategic industries, investing in food self-sufficiency, canceling or renegotiating all contracts signed under foreign pressure, teaching sovereignty as a national value, not a political slogan. And what of General Dumbia? He declined to run. He stepped down as interim head of state. He retired quietly to a modest home in northern Côte d'Ivoire. His final words to the press, "I was not the revolution. I was just the man who refused to pretend any longer." Alassane Ouattara, now a private citizen, remained in the country. He did not flee. He did not try to rebuild a base. And when approached by the new government to offer testimony during the Sovereignty Commission hearings, he agreed, not as a defendant, but as a former leader who had chosen to leave history honestly rather than hide in its shadows. The world kept watching, but with a new lens. What many thought would become another failed African coup had become something else entirely, a bloodless reset. A confession turned constitution, a former president turned example, and a military that gave power back, not took it. Across Africa, something had shifted. The idea that sovereignty could only come through force or fantasy was replaced by something tangible: courage, clarity, and collective choice. In Ivory Coast, a general asked a fallen leader to tell the truth. The world expected defiance. What they got instead was history. The rhythm of Ivorian drums builds. Over it, the voice of a child recites, "We are no longer afraid, we are no longer borrowed, we are no longer ruled, we are Ivory Coast."